friends, my name is Dasha. Welcome back to my channel, and welcome to my March and February wrap-up. I wasn't able to film or upload my February wrap-up because I was moving and I didn't have internet and all this nonsense, so I'm gonna do it today. I read 4 books in February and 7 in March, so 11 books total, and I'm gonna go in my usual order from my least favorite to my favorite, but I'm gonna split them up into the months that I read them in. So let's go ahead with my February books. So my least favorite book in February was The Red Market by Scott Carney. This is a book about the sale of human bodies and human body parts, so all things involving blood, organs, bones, hair, human surrogates, child adoption, all of these topics. And it's basically an examination of where they begin, where they end, like where the body parts come from, where your adopted children are sourced from, all of these kind of things to do with like the human body as a commodity. And the author actually goes and investigates some of these markets and like where they source the body parts, where they ship them to, all this kind of stuff. This was disappointing for me. This was a 3.5 star read, so it wasn't like bad. It just really let me down. I think there's 2 main reasons for that. One of the main reasons this really disappointed me was that the author lived a long time in India, and he like taught there and he worked there. I think he studied there too. So while I understand why he did this, a lot of his research was based in India, and it felt like it only gave a very one-dimensional perspective of these issues. And while there was a brief mention of what happens to the body parts once they're sourced in India and shipped out to Canada or the US, it just kind of felt very repetitive and very focused on India for absolutely like no reason. I'm sure there are these kinds of atrocities happening in other countries, so it felt very like targeted to India. And it felt, I don't want to say lazy, because I understand that that's where the author lived for a long time and he had the opportunity to study these places, but it just felt, it did feel a little lazy in that there was almost no focus on anywhere else. It also probably didn't help paint India in a very good light, because he was just constantly going in on like India having these like blood farmers and bone thieves and people shipping out body parts and abusing human surrogates. It just like didn't really paint it in a good light, and it just kind of bothered me because I wish he had explored other countries a little bit more. The second issue I really had with this that kind of diminished my enjoyment of this was the fact that it seemed like there was a lot of topics crammed into one pretty small book. This book was not that long at all, and it just kind of felt like he was trying to cover too many things all at once. So it either would have benefited from being a longer book with the same topics, or just pick a few of those topics, expand on them a little bit more, and then keep the same length of book. Now, because it covers so many things, I think this book is a great starting point for further research, and it also was pretty like educational / informational. I did learn a lot of things that I didn't know. There was some horrific stories in there. It did give me some of what I wanted from that perspective. Like I did learn some things. And I do think that it's a great point for further research, because there are sources and he does bring up these like cases that you can do more research into. Just overall, it was kind of disappointing. Not my favorite, but still a 3.5 star read. And I would recommend this if you are interested in the topic. Obviously, it's kind of gory, it's kind of disgusting, but it was solid. And another thing I really enjoyed about it was that there was really good discussions about capitalism and the commodification of human bodies, and it kind of forces you to look at what you think are your ethics and how you would react if something like this would happen to you. Like, for example, if you know someone that's in need of an organ transplant, how far would you go to make sure that they have what they need, even if the sourcing of that organ is not always ethical? So it brings up these really interesting discussions, especially, like I said, the discussion about like capitalism and the fact that human bodies have become a good, a marketable good, a commodity. It's really interesting. So I would recommend this if the topic sounds interesting to you. It is a great springboard for more research and for these kinds of interesting discussions. It just was not quite what I thought it was going to be. The next book I want to talk about is A Clockwork Orange by Anthony Burgess. This is a classic sci-fi about this futuristic Britain where our main character Alex is running around town with his friends, who he calls his droogs, and they are just basically wreaking havoc, doing crime, doing bad things, being ultra violent, all that good stuff, until one day Alex gets caught. And this was something I had started this book before, but I got really friggin' confused because the author put a lot of Russian words into the book as slang. So I guess in this alternate timeline, there was a lot more exchange between Russia and Britain. So like the youth picked up a lot of Russian words as slang. And so you're reading it, and like this is coming from someone who speaks Russian, you're reading it and there's these words written in English letters, but they're Russian words, so you have to sound them out. And listen, if you don't speak Russian, absolutely go into this book with a glossary because it is a hassle. It is really like a completely different reading experience. You kind of have to shift the way you normally read just to kind of understand what's happening. So the first time I tried reading it, I had a really tough time. I put it down. I was just like not feeling it. It didn't help that I was reading it on audiobook and the narrator was English, so he had this like really thick accent, and then he was reading Russian words in his thick accent, and I was just like, I lost the plot and I was like, this is not happening. Then I picked it back up in February and I loved it, absolutely loved it. The use of language in this book is friggin' genius. There are, like I said, certain words that are written in the English like letters, but they are Russian words. And the thing is, how Anthony Burgess spelled the Russian words in English gave them almost a new meaning because of their English spelling, if that makes sense. And it was just this like brilliant, like I've never seen anything quite like it. For example, one of the most obvious examples is the use of the word хорошо, which is the word good in Russian. However, it is spelled in the book as horror show, because when you read it, obviously хорошо in like an English accent, it becomes kind of like horror show. And it's really friggin' interesting how it changes the meaning of the word almost, because good in Russian then becomes horror show in this like new slang English. Anyways, I just thought it was really, really well done. I will say, if you're at all familiar with the book and kind of the lore around it, you will know that there's an infamous last chapter. So when the book was first published in the US, it actually didn't even have the last chapter. And there's been a lot of debate back and forth about whether it should be included, whether it makes sense with the story. I know Anthony Burgess himself really, really advocated for keeping that last chapter because to him it made the point for the book. I'm in the camp of people who did not like the last chapter. I think it kind of undid all of the work from the book and even goes against the title of the book. A Clockwork Orange is something that it basically means you can't change the nature of something. So to have the last chapter kind of undo that whole meaning didn't really work with me. I think it would have been a lot better if it wasn't there, but that's just like personal opinion, and I'd love to know if you've read this book, what you thought, and if you did enjoy the last chapter or not. Because while I do understand why it was put in there, and it makes sense with the themes that he was going for with the last chapter, I don't think it made sense with the themes of the whole book before it. So that's where I stand, but this was a 4-star for me. I thought it was really cool. In terms of like classic sci-fi, I don't always have the best luck, so this was really, really successful for me. And I would absolutely recommend it if you want to get into kind of more modern classics. Like I said, if you do read this, read it with a glossary because it's a hassle, but it is like a fantastic read. Really gruesome, but like so worth it for that payoff. So the next book I want to talk about is These Violent Delights by Chloe Gong. This was very kindly gifted to me by my friend Ray. Thank you so much. This was a really anticipated read for me, and when it showed up at my doorstep, I was just so excited. I had to read it almost right away. So this is the really hyped young adult reimagining of Romeo and Juliet that's been going around. It is set in 1920s Shanghai. We have Roma and Juliet, who are the heirs to these like opposing, warring crime families, but they have to work together because there is this like mysterious illness that's sweeping the city. And the other kicker is they used to be in a relationship about 4 years ago until a betrayal rocked both of their worlds. So there's a lot of really interesting dynamics going on here, and I'm so glad that this did not disappoint. I personally really, really believed the characters. I believed the tension between Roma and Juliet. I believed their chemistry. I know not everybody did, but to me it really worked. I loved the dynamic that they had, from being previously involved to having like broken up super nastily. I thought it brought a really interesting perspective to their relationship, their working relationship in this book. I also thought that as characters, not even just Roma and Juliet, but all of the side characters were really quite believable. I thought their actions made sense. I thought their motivations were quite believable and made sense. I also thought Juliet was a fascinating character in her own right. So Juliet spent some time in New York City as a student, and she grappled a lot and continues to grapple in this book with her identity. And I really related to it, despite not being, obviously, I'm not Chinese, but I related a lot to her grapples with like being an immigrant in a Western country and being simultaneously fetishized but also like disregarded, and people like don't really want to associate with you. I thought that it was handled really interestingly, and like everything about Juliet's inner struggles as well as just general like socio-political commentary in this book was woven in so seamlessly. There's a ton of context given for the politics that are happening in Shanghai. So you have like the rise of the communists, and also like all of these immigrants from Western countries coming in and starting to build and kind of slowly take over. And despite the fact that these war and crime families were obviously fictional, I thought that everything else kind of played in very well, and it felt very seamless and it felt very real. And I know some people thought that the kind of historical context and the political context was kind of shoved in there. I thought it was pretty well done. I really enjoyed it. I'm also a history nerd, so like I love seeing that kind of stuff. I love tying what I read in here to my existing knowledge and like being able to do further research based on the things that were included in here. Yes, sometimes there was like that young adult logic and like plot conveniences and certain things that happened like that didn't quite make sense, but like I'm able to forgive that. I thought it was good. I haven't felt this way reading a book since like high school. I stayed up late to finish it. I was gooped and gagged by everything that was happening. I loved it. I thought it was just so much fun. I will also say, if you are worried, like I'm personally a fan of the original Romeo and Juliet. I love the original play. If you are not, I would not say that this is a direct retelling. This is more of a reimagining. So if that's something that worried you, I would still try this if the general premise interests you, because it's not as extreme as the original play. Overall, this ended up getting 4 stars from me. I absolutely loved it, and I would recommend it if it interests you, because I thought it was just so much fun. The fact that Chloe Gong is a debut author that's younger than me that came up with this is like unbelievable. Props to her. My favorite book that I read in February was The Only Good Indians by Stephen Graham Jones. This is an adult horror novel about a group of young men from the Blackfeet tribe who had this kind of hunting, I don't want to call it an accident. They had a hunting trip in their youth that ended in a bit of a massacre for some of the elk that they were hunting. And 10 years later, their past is coming back to haunt them. And listen, this was so good. This was so good. This was everything I wanted from a horror novel. It was gruesome, it was suspenseful, it had fantastic characters, it had just really cool, spooky atmosphere. It was so good. One thing I will say is that if you do start reading this book and you are extremely confused by the writing style, you are not alone. I had a really hard time. I found myself kind of going back and rereading some stuff because it has a bit of a flow of consciousness writing style. You're kind of reading as if you're in certain characters' minds. So I would absolutely recommend the audiobook. I think that having someone actually read it kind of feels like you are listening to someone's inner monologue, and it kind of flows a little bit better. And then once you kind of get used to it, you're able to read it physically. Listen, I tore through this book in 2 days. I thought it was so good. I did like the first half a little bit more than the second half, just because it was a bit more focused and it had those elements of horror that I personally like. So overall, it's kind of like spiritual, supernatural horror. But in that first half, it was really focused on human paranoia and like human fears, like real human fears, and these themes that were just, to me, they're always interesting when they're in horror, so I loved seeing them. These themes did carry over to the second half, but it was a little bit different. If you've read the book, you know what I'm talking about. It's really hard to talk about it without spoiling. But like the themes did carry over. They were just a lot more present in the first half when you didn't know what was going on. And then in the second half, you just got to sit back and watch it all happen in front of you, which was pretty fun. Overall, this was just like absolutely fantastic. I haven't read a good horror book like that in a while. I thought it was great. Absolutely recommend it. This was a 4 stars and definitely my favorite book of the month. So next up, we're gonna get into my March books, and I'll start with my least favorite book of March, which was unfortunately My Soul to Keep by Tananarive Due. This is an adult, horror question mark, urban fantasy question mark, thriller. It's a weird kind of in-between genre. So you follow Jessica and Dawit, who are this like happy family. They have a child. They're both incredibly intelligent, have great careers. But Dawit is hiding a little bit of a secret. He is from this like ancient religious group that is actually immortal. So it's causing some conflict, and the story kind of takes off once you find out that. I started this in February, and I just did not want to pick it up. And listen, it's not that the book was like written in this really convoluted way. It was written in a super, super accessible writing style. I just didn't like it. I do have a full themed vlog that will be coming a little bit later with this book in it, so I don't want to give too much of that away. But overall, I just didn't really like the characters. I thought that they were selfish and took really, really, really weird decisions that didn't quite make sense. And I also just found that there was just like pacing issues. It was way too long, and then when action happened, it happened too fast. I might not be the correct audience for this book. Maybe this book is more urban fantasy, which didn't quite work. I just genuinely did not really enjoy this book, which sucks because I wanted to read, and I still do want to read, Tananarive Du's other book, The Good House. It's on my list of books to read for 2021, and I am still somewhat excited for it because I've heard a lot of praise for that book. This just really let me down. I rated it a 3-star on Goodreads, but honestly it's more of like a 2.5 star just because of like personal enjoyment. I just didn't really have fun. The next book I want to talk about is King of Scars by Leigh Bardugo. This follows the events of the Grisha trilogy and the Six of Crows duology. We're following Nikolai, Zoya, and Nina as they kind of navigate the Grisha universe. And before I start, a quick plug about our upcoming live show. I'm hosting a live show with my friends Ray and Robin. I have all the details linked down below. It'll be over on Ray's channel, but I also do have an announcement video if you want to go watch that. If you're watching this video the day it goes up, the live show is tomorrow, April 10th. We will be discussing all of the books in the GRISHAVERSE that are currently published, including Rule of Wolves, because we are anticipating the Netflix show, so we'll talk about that too. King of Scars will of course be discussed, so I'll be very brief about my thoughts here, but of course just wanted to kind of plug that. I hope you join us tomorrow, grab some snacks and drinks, and come talk GRISHAVERSE with us. But basically, my thoughts on this book, I did not like it at all. I really thought I would. I loved Nikolai, I loved Nina. Zoya was annoying, but like she got more time in this book, so you kind of got to see her develop. But I really was excited to see Nikolai in his own book, but like it just was not good. We didn't get nearly enough Nikolai for me to enjoy it. The plot just took these really friggin' weird turns. Zoya was still kind of annoying, but at least she got a little bit better. But like there was just these really weird turns, and then you had someone reappear that I just didn't want to see again. I was like, why are you even part of the story? I did not really know what was happening half the time, and I've started Rule of Wolves since, and I'm just hoping it ends well, because right now it's not going well. This was a 2.5 star read for me. It was just not great. So the next book I want to talk about is This Is How You Lose the Time War by Amal El-Motar and Max Gladstone. This is an adult sci-fi novella following two agents on opposing sides of a time war. So they basically travel back and forward through time and leave each other letters and eventually fall apart through their letters. This was just not really good. This was just extremely boring and like way too overwritten, and I understand the point of this was to be kind of just beautiful and lyrical, and it wasn't supposed to be focused on the sci-fi aspects, but I almost found myself being more interested in the sci-fi aspects that weren't even fully explained. And then the actual like love letters just felt really weird because I didn't understand why they fell in love. I understand certain elements of like why they were attracted to one another, maybe because they were like on opposing sides. They were two agents on opposing sides of the war and they admired each other's technique. Like, sure, I understand that. But if you wanted to sell this to me as a love story, I feel like it needed more time. If you wanted to sell this to me as just beautiful lyrical writing, I don't know if it needed, I don't know. There was just something off about it. I did not care at all. I found it pretty boring. The parts between the letters, when they were like setting up the delivery of the letters, because it's not just literal written letters, right? It's these kind of very elaborate ways to deliver the message of the letter, and I found that was almost more interesting than the actual content of the letters. I don't know, there just wasn't enough there to sink my teeth into. Obviously the writing was beautiful, like it was breathtaking writing, but it was just kind of, what's the word? There was just no substance there for me, despite the beautiful writing. So this got a 3-star for me. If you're interested, I mean, it is super short, but like at the same time, you have to go back and reread things a lot because it is so like overwritten. So I don't even know if it's that short to read. I don't know. It was just very mediocre for me, unfortunately, which sucks because it had a ton of good reviews. Everyone loves it, but it's just not it for me. The next book I want to talk about is Fight Club by Chuck Palahniuk. How do I even give a synopsis for this? I guess it's some guy whose life kind of goes in the shitter, and then he meets Tyler Durden, who introduces him to the Fight Club, where men go to fight. And there's a lot of other stuff happening. This book was a lot. I couldn't even give this a rating because I can't wrap my head around what I read. I guess the point of this book is to be kind of confusing and satirical and like written in a very convoluted way. Just none of it made sense. But I guess that was also like the artistic intent behind it. It's just a lot. I've never watched the movie, so it was kind of interesting to read it like without knowing what happens. No one had ever spoiled it for me. So that was kind of cool. And some of the discussions that were had about like boys who were raised by single mothers and the need to have something to make you feel alive when you're stuck in this like corporate world and living in an apartment that you don't even really like. I guess there was like some of those kind of themes. It was just very convoluted. I don't even know how to talk about this book. So yeah, I didn't even end up rating it. I think I somewhat enjoyed it. I think it needs a reread to fully enjoy it. I think that's kind of where I stand on it right now. If you've read Fight Club, let me know. I heard the movie obviously is kind of, it stands alone from the book. It kind of does things a little differently. So I'd maybe want to watch it and see how it compares and see if it helps me kind of deepen my understanding, because I feel like just my first read through really only grazed the surface of the story and the themes. So I don't know how to feel about it. I'm editing and I'm a moron, and I realized that I forgot to include a whole book. So yeah, in March, I also read Severance by Ling Ma. This is a, I don't want to call it dystopian, what's the word I'm looking for? It's like after a global pandemic, and it's like a satirical literary fiction that's also kind of post-apocalyptic, and we're following someone who basically was like working in New York. She was like the typical millennial, like struggling with the job market, got this job she doesn't really care for, that's corporate, and then when the pandemic takes over, like this poor girl barely even like notices how bad things are because she's just so used to her routine and like going to work and all this stuff. And it was a 4 to 5 star read for me. This was just absolutely fucking brilliant. I thought that sometimes a lot of the themes were like super ham-fisted, like shoved in your face, made super obvious that like this is a critique of capitalism, this is about the immigrant experience in America, and like sometimes I like it to be a bit more subtle, but the moments where there was that subtlety was just like fantastic. Sometimes it was just so brilliantly done. And there's just a lot of levels and a lot of things to unpack in the book, and I thought it was really, really fun for such a short read. Like there was just so much packed in there, and beyond just having like that satirical thematic element, there was also like it was dual timeline. So one timeline was like leading up and at the beginning of the pandemic, and the other timeline was like after she gets out of New York and finds this like band of survivors, people that are immune. And I really like that there was that balance of the before and then the after, and the after has a tiny bit more of like a typical post-apocalyptic plot line where there's actually a plot, but before, because you know what's happening, because you know what's coming and what's gonna happen, there's just this like really interesting character study almost, and I didn't think I would like that, but I think that it was really, really well done in this. It was also like a super short read. You can just fly through it, and because of the really fun thematic aspect of it, I felt like it just made it more enjoyable than just like a really short book. Like there was no need for extensive world building or character building. It was just really something to like sink your teeth into without having to worry about logic or world building or character building. And the other thing I thought was really funny was reading this in the land of COVID. The author predicted certain things just based on like capitalism and human nature, and just seeing it in the year of our Lord 2021 was hilarious. For example, she straight up predicted that we would have like Gucci and Louis Vuitton and Supreme masks, and that would just be like a thing, and that security guards would be hired to guard like office buildings and like wealthy people's places. And like it's funny how on point that was, knowing what we know now. So anyways, that was a book I forgot. Let's get back to it. All right, the penultimate book I want to talk about is Are Prisons Obsolete by Angela Y. Davis. This is a very short nonfiction, basically argument for prison abolition, and it's fantastic. So I read this partially because I have a paper to write on racial capitalism and prison abolition. I also saw Gabe talk about this, and he like gave it a glowing review, so I was kind of somewhat interested in it, and honestly it was just extremely well written, extremely well articulated. There was a lot of really interesting points that were brought up. Obviously prison abolition seems like a very extreme topic, but the way that Angela Davis approached it was quite interesting and made you really examine how you view punishment and crime and prisons in society. So really well done for that. There was a lot of stuff I took out of it, not only for my paper, but just for my own understanding of the criminal justice system. And honestly, like I thought it was great. It was short, it was to the point, concise, and it was really well written. So this got a 5-star for me. The final book I want to talk about is The Devil All the Time by Donald Ray Pollock. This is a kind of horror American Gothic literature book it's about a lot of people, but I guess mainly you follow this young boy whose father served in the Vietnam War. He's dealing with a lot of PTSD, and he's just basically kind of growing up, dealing with the people around him. It's a lot of like small town people and a lot of small town like politics and conflicts. This book had a ton of discussion about religion and kind of the small town experience and PTSD and all these just like really interesting discussions. I don't know if I would call it quite horror. Everyone was terrible and there was a lot of horrific stuff happening, but I don't know if it's quite horror. I also would not recommend to read the Goodreads synopsis. It just gives a little bit too much away in my opinion. I think you're better off going into this book not knowing too much. Like if I had to just pitch this book to you, I would say it's about terrible people doing terrible things and about someone trying to figure out if the actions they take matter at all. That doesn't make it sound very appealing, but I promised you it's really good. For some reason, I haven't been able to stop thinking about this book. I just thought it was really, really interestingly done. I thought when you were switching between perspectives, it just lingered on them long enough so that you weren't like desperate to go back to the other one, because all of them were interesting, but you just got enough so that you wanted to keep reading. I thought that, again, the themes discussed were just absolutely brilliantly done. You really felt that kind of American Gothic small town atmosphere. There was just these like really horrific moments. There was these really beautiful moments. It made you question your morality. And again, like the whole idea of, does anything you do really matter? I thought it was just brilliantly done. I gave this a 4.5 out of 5 stars. Like I said, I haven't been able to stop thinking about it for some reason. I absolutely loved it. I thought it was just fantastic, and I would absolutely recommend it. Not even necessarily if you're like into horror, but if you like picking apart all these like little themes like I did. This book had a ton of them and it was just so masterfully done. And that was it. That was all of the books I'd read in the months of February and March, all 11 of them. Like I mentioned earlier, if you've read some of these, come and talk to me about them. I'd love to know what you guys think, because there were some really interesting and thought-provoking books that I read the last couple of months, so would love to talk to you about them. You can also come talk to me on my social media, which is linked down below as always. Don't forget about our GRISHAVERSE live show that's coming up. Details will be linked, as well as my video. And other than that, I'll see you in the next one. Bye!